Now, you may have heard that the governor and the lieutenant governor and the speaker recently asked state agencies to cut 5% out of their budget. Well, in that same request, they made an exception for things that even they considered so inadequately funded we can't cut them. Even they considered as being so important we can't cut them. They made an exception for the children's health insurance program, for foster care, for our eligibility system that enrolls people in public benefits, for Medicaid, for debt service, for public employee retirement, for the foundation school program. So they said the 5% cut won't apply to that. But it applies to everything else. Well, the problem is that just doesn't raise you much money. That would raise you about $2.1 billion if you made the cut for the whole biennium. And they actually think when it's all said and done, they'll only be able to get about $1 billion out of that 5% cut, because we're already deep into the biennium and a lot of those things are going to figure out they can't cut. And so my point is, we need 17. That 5% cut would only bring us about $1 billion. A 10% cut would only bring us a couple of billion. So the kinds of cuts that would be necessary would be very deep. Now, to illustrate that, show this next slide. Here's the slide of what is exempt or accepted on the left and what isn't accepted out on the right. So the 5% cut gets borne by health and human services that aren't Medicaid or foster care, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, higher education, our community and junior colleges, UT Austin, Texas A&M, and health insurance for public employees. That's what we're talking about when we talk about cutting the budget. Let's look at what we would be cutting. The 5% cut, if applied to the present 2010-2011 budget, would bring you out of child protective services and community care waivers and state schools and hospitals $513 million. Out of a CPS system that's been struggling for years, out of state schools and hospitals that the United States Justice Department sued because conditions were so terrible. It would take $296 million out of the Department of Criminal Justice. It would take $93 million out of our community colleges at a time when many people are flooding back to community college in an effort to get retooled in this economy. It would take $77 million, mostly financial aid, out of higher education at a time when families can least afford to send kids to school. It would take money directly from higher ed, $39 million from UT, $36 million from A&M, $30 million from UTMB in Galveston, $20 million from the Cancer Center, $27 million from the Attorney General in his efforts to collect child support for children, and $156 million in health insurance for public employees. So the point is, these cuts, there isn't any line item in the state budget labeled frivolity. There isn't any line item in the state budget labeled waste. The money comes out of these important underfunded programs. Often people say, well, what if we just stripped Medicaid down to the bare bones? We got rid of every option and just did the minimum that the federal government required. Well, that would mean you would be providing health care to pregnant women, you would roll that back from pregnant women who are at 185% of poverty below to 150 and below, and you would be rolling back long-term nursing care. And as you all know, Medicare is a federally funded program that pays for 65 and older, but it doesn't pay for long-term care. Long-term care is paid for by Medicaid, the state-federal program. It actually reaches deeply into the working class or the lower middle class, and we could roll that back to 74% of poverty. And we could eliminate mental health care for adults, and we could cut provider rates that are already so inadequate many providers won't take on Medicaid. So my point is that these cuts are pretty painful. So we need $17 billion, and what do we do? Well, there's not going to be any way. Can you skip this next slide and go to this slide right here? There's not going to be any way to avoid this. And the Legislative Budget Board recently did some projections, so these are government numbers. And what we've done is make them a little easier to understand, that give you a best case scenario. And by best case we mean that the economy recovers really strong, and so all that need for more money is taken care of by economic growth. So that growth and needs a wash. How much would we be short? And what you see here is the current budget in the middle and the 2012-13 budget on the right. General revenue would be $75 billion. You see we lose almost $7 billion in federal stimulus money. We've spent our cash on hand. We've spent the money in the property tax relief fund that we'd been holding back. We probably do get a permanent school fund payout this time. Y'all may remember the stock market had tumbled so far that the permanent school fund couldn't pay out for 2010, 2011, but we think we will get a payout for 2012-13. And so when you look at our total GR budget, you see best case scenario that we're going to be about $10 or $11 billion short. Now if the economy doesn't recover strong, and if revenue growth doesn't match the needs that we've been through, then you can just add on top of that $10 billion, and you can see how short we're going to be. So let's go back 2 slides right there. So what do we do? Well, and I just gave this talk not 2 hours ago to a room full of 450 superintendents. So it's kind of interesting. I'm going to gauge your reaction versus theirs. So here is what mainstream economists, not crazy right-wing nuts, mainstream economists say. That everything being equal, taxes do have a weak negative effect on growth. But that negative effect from taxes is more than offset by the positive growth you get from higher public spending on things like education and transportation that are very important for your economy. Now, people seem to understand that as the economy grows, we need more public services. That everybody seems to understand that. If your economy is getting bigger, you need more public services. What some people seem to have trouble wrapping their minds around is that for the economy to grow, you have to have more public services. The tides don't create the moon. The moon creates the tides. And it's important to understand the role of the public sector in creating economic growth.